Welcome everybody to this virtual Armistice Day event sponsored by the Madison chapter of Veterans for Peace and the Progressive magazine. World War I was without a doubt a change in the history of warfare. The casualties suffered by participants in World War I and civilians who were affected by it dwarfed those of previous wars. A recent estimate by a European educational institute states that military and civilian casualties in World War I reached nearly 40 million, 20 million dead and 21 million wounded. The total number of deaths includes 9.7 million military personnel and about 10 million civilians. Armistice Day commemorates the end of hostilities in that war. A treaty was signed at 5:45 a.m., and the cessation of hostilities between the parties in World War I took effect at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Armistice Day is a holiday about commemorating peace. World War I came to be known as the war that would end all wars, but it has not. Since that time, countless conflicts have occurred across the planet, each with more and more civilian casualties and with more and more elaborate and destructive military weaponry. Tonight, we commemorate those lost in those wars in the spirit of a war to end all wars and an armistice that will mean that there will never be war again. We start our program tonight with Larry Orr, a member of the Madison chapter of Veterans for Peace here in this city of Madison, Wisconsin, talking about the national efforts to reclaim this notion of Armistice Day.
Greetings. My name is Larry Orr, and I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, the Madison, Wisconsin chapter named for Clarence Kalin. Clarence Kalin went to Spain in the 1930s to fight fascism as a member of the Lincoln Brigades. He survived and came home to work for peace for the rest of his life. If you are from Madison, you may know his monument in James Madison Park, a monument to him and to the Lincoln Brigades. You may know our chapter of Veterans for Peace for our work on Memorial Day, both our Memorial Day service in James Madison Park at Gates of Heaven and the Memorial Mile on Atwood Avenue along Old Brick Park, about a mile of representative tombstone markers. These are in rows of 5 markers each, about 2.5 feet apart, row by row, and it goes on for about a mile, thousands of them. And these commemorate the U.S. military dead in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't have markers for the unfortunate enemy dead, nor for the collateral damage, as the civilian deaths are sometimes called. No one seems to be too good about counting those numbers. I'd like to share with you a message from the national headquarters of Veterans for Peace. Over 100 years ago, the world celebrated peace as a universal principle. The First World War had just ended, and nations mourning their dead collectively called for an end to all wars. Armistice Day was born and was designated as a day to be dedicated to the cause of world peace and to be thereafter celebrated. After World War II, the U.S. Congress decided to rebrand November 11th as Veterans Day. Armistice Day was flipped from a day for peace into a day for displays of militarism. Veterans for Peace has taken the lead in lifting up the original intention of November 11th as a day for peace. As veterans, we know that a day that celebrates peace, not war, is the best way to honor the sacrifices of veterans. We want generations after us to never know the destruction that war has wrought on the people of the earth. Thank you.
Sisters and brothers, this is Sai Khan, honored to join my friends and comrades on Armistice Day 2021. So many times in history, we watched them march away. Some cry out for and pray for this father's daughter, for this mother's son. What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is over? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done? Some are quick to honor, some are quick to blame. Few can face the truth that this all happens in our name. Before the first shot's fired, our battle has begun. What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is over? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done? Those who fight the battles are not those who make the laws, but bravery is still bravery, even in an unjust cause. From the hand that signs the order to the hand that fires the gun. What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is over? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done? Some lie solitary beneath a hero's stone. Some return to loved ones, but will always be alone. Something sacred will be lost, even if the war is won. What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is over? What will happen to the rest of us when the war is done?
Our next speaker is Alfred McCoy. He is the Harrington Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and author of In the Shadow of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power, and the forthcoming book, To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change, which will be released on November 16th, just a few days after this Armistice Day event. The book is a sweep through the rise and fall of world empires over a span of 700 years, from the Black Death of 1350 to the coming climate crisis of 2050. The book intertwines imperial history and the history of energy, culminating in global warming and the decline of the U.S. liberal world order. Professor Alfred McCoy, welcome.
Good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I want to thank the Veterans Day Committee for inviting me to give this lecture. And in response to this kind invitation from our veterans, I want to speak about the countries recent wars and the way that they've eroded U.S. global power and weakened Washington's liberal world order, and then speculate about how climate change might lead to future armed conflicts. Now, when the leaders of over 100 nations gathered in Glasgow for the UN Climate Conference, there was and has been much discussion about the disastrous effects of global warming on the environment. But there was little discussion, and I would argue less awareness, of its political impact, particularly on the current world order that has made this international gathering and others like it possible. World orders are deeply rooted global systems that structure relations among nations and the condition of the lives of all the millions of people who live within them. For the past 600 years, it has taken a catastrophic event, such as war or plague, to overturn such entrenched global systems. Within a decade, however, climate change will be wreaking a cumulative devastation sufficient to surpass past catastrophes, creating conditions for the eclipse of Washington's liberal world order and the rise of Beijing's decidedly illiberal global system. In this sweeping imperial transition, global warming is catalyzing a veritable witch's brew of change that is eroding America's once unchallenged hegemony and its world system. By charting the course of climate change, we can draw a political roadmap for the rest of this tempestuous 21st century. From the end of U.S. global hegemony around 2030, through Beijing's brief world leadership that might last until 2050, all the way to this century's closing decades of environmental crisis, which may yet produce a new kind of empowered world order capable of mitigating this global disaster. Now, America's decline started right here at home as a bipartisan effort. While Washington was spending 2 decades fighting costly wars to secure the Middle East oil, just about the time that fuel was going to join cordwood and coal in the dustbin of history, Beijing was using those same years to build industries that would make it the world's workshop. And in a major miscalculation, Washington, both parties, admitted Beijing into a World Trade Organization in 2001, bizarrely confident that a compliant China would somehow join the global economy without changing the balance of power. According to 2 former members of the Obama administration, and I quote, "Across the political spectrum, we in the U.S. foreign policy community shared the underlying belief that U.S. power and hegemony could readily mold China to the United States' liking. All sides of the policy debate erred." A bit more bluntly, foreign policy expert John Mearsheimer recently concluded in an article in Foreign Affairs, and I quote, "Both Democratic and Republican administrations promoted investment in China and welcomed the country into the global trading system, thinking it would become a peace-loving democracy and a responsible stakeholder in a U.S.-led international order." In the 15 years following its admission to the World Trade Organization, or WTO, Beijing's exports to the U.S. grew nearly 5-fold to an amazing $460 billion every year, and its foreign currency reserves surged from just $200 billion to an unprecedented $4 trillion by 2014, a vast hoard of cash that it used to build a modern military and win allies across Eurasia and Africa. Meanwhile, Washington was wasting a similar $5 trillion on profitless wars in the Middle East in lieu of spending on infrastructure, innovation, or education, a time-tested formula for imperial decline. When the Pentagon Special Inspector assessing the war in Afghanistan interviewed a man named Jeffrey Eggers, who was a former White House staffer and a Navy SEAL veteran, he said, and I quote, "What did we get for this $1 trillion effort? Was it worth $1 trillion? After the killing of Osama bin Laden, I said that Osama was probably laughing in his watery grave considering how much we have spent on Afghanistan," end quote. Donald Trump's presidency brought forth a growing realization at home and abroad that Washington's world leadership was ending far sooner than anyone could have imagined. For 4 years, Trump attacked long-standing U.S. alliances while degrading the international organizations that were the hallmark of Washington's world system. And to top it all off, he denounced a fair American election as fraudulent and sparked a mob attack on the U.S. Capitol, almost mocking America's long history of promoting democracy to legitimate its global leadership. And in the riot's aftermath, the Republican Party has embraced Trump's demagoguery about electoral fraud as a veritable article of faith. No nation can exercise consistent global leadership if one of its ruling parties descends into persistent irrationality, something Britain's Conservative Party showed during its imperial decline back in the 1950s. After his inauguration last January, Joe Biden proclaimed America is back and promised to revive its liberal international leadership. But European leaders, mindful of Trump's battering of the NATO alliance, continued to make plans for their own common defense without America. As one French diplomat put it, and I quote, "We aren't in the old status quo where we can pretend the Donald Trump presidency never existed and the world was the same as 4 years ago." Indeed, Biden's humiliating retreat from Afghanistan, as Taliban guerrillas equipped with tennis sneakers and aging Soviet rifles crushed an Afghan army armed with billions in U.S. gear, showed the world that America's decline had become a bipartisan effort. Global leadership lost is not readily recovered, particularly when a rival power is waiting in the wings to fill the void. As Washington's strategic position weakens, China has been pressing relentlessly to displace it and dominate the vast landmass of Eurasia, a place that is home to 70% of the world's population and productivity and is thus a key step on China's path to global primacy. Should China's relentless advance continue, there will be serious consequences for the world as we know it. As the first hegemon that did not participate in the painful 5-century process of forging this current liberal world order, China's rise could ultimately threaten this order's core principles of universal human rights and inviolable state sovereignty. Beyond Washington's strategic failings, there was, however, another more fundamental force eroding its global power. After 70 years of profligate fossil fuel consumption, synonymous with Washington's world system, climate change has now gained sufficient force for profound disruptions of the human community. Through the past 20 years of bipartisan denials, evasions, and compromises, the U.S., as of 2019, still relied on fossil fuels for 63% of its energy. The situation was even worse in China, which depended on fossil fuels for a full 85% of its total power and generated only 13% from renewable sources. As energy expert Vaclav Smil has explained, the underlying problem was 150 years of embedded inertia that has made, quote, the production, delivery, and consumption of fossil fuels the world's most extensive and most expensive web of energy-intensive infrastructures. In any transition beyond fossil fuels, the world's two largest economies would have to play a determinative role. Global carbon dioxide emissions arose by a staggering 50% from 22 gigatons in 1997 to a peak of 33 gigatons in 2018. Significantly, China accounted for 29% of the world's total, and the U.S. another 14%, for a combined 43% of all greenhouse gases. At the 2019 Madrid Climate Conference, UN Secretary Antonio Guterres warned that if current emissions continue, global warming will reach as high as 3.9 degrees centigrade by century's end, with what he called catastrophic consequences for all life on the planet. And at Glasgow 2 weeks ago, the Secretary General renewed this warning, saying, "We are digging our own graves. Sea level rise is double the rate it was 30 years ago. Oceans are hotter than ever and getting warmer faster. Parts of the Amazon rainforest now emit more carbon than they absorb. We are still careening towards climate catastrophe," end quote. In the 600 years since the age of exploration, first brought the continents into close and continuous contact, 90 empires have come and gone. But there have been just 3 new world orders which survived until each in turn suffered some cataclysm of mass death. After the Black Death of 1350 killed 60% of medieval Europe's population, Iberian empires expanded to form the First World Order, which lasted 300 years until 1805. And just as the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars launched the succeeding British imperial system, which continued for a full century until 1914, so Washington's hegemony and its current world order arose from the massive destruction of World War II. But now, global warming is unleashing cataclysmic environmental changes that will soon overshadow these past catastrophes and damage, if not destroy, the global order that has pervaded the planet for the past 70 years. As wildfires worsen with each succeeding summer, ocean storms intensify, lands aridify, and the seas rise, many millions of the world's poor will be uprooted from their precarious perch along seashores, floodplains, and desert fringe. If we recall that the arrival of just 2 million refugees at the borders of the United States and the European Union between 2016 and 2018 unleashed a surge of populist demagoguery seen in Britain's Brexit, Europe's ultranationalism, and Trump's election, then just imagine the political upheavals to come when climate change generates some 200 million refugees by mid-century. As 1 million refugees a year crowd America's southern border, while storms and fires batter coast and countryside, the U.S. will have to retreat from the world to cope with these domestic crises. Similar and simultaneous pressures worldwide will cripple the international cooperation that has long been the core of Washington's world order. So, we might ask, when will these shifting geopolitics and this climate cataclysm converge to erase Washington's current world order? Beijing plans to complete both the technological transfer of its own economy and much of the massive trans-Eurasian infrastructure it's building by 2027, just 6 years from now. That projected date complements a prediction by the U.S. National Intelligence Council, Washington's supreme analytic intelligence body, that's reported in 2012, quote, China alone will probably have the largest economy, surpassing that of the United States a few years before 2030. The accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers has projected that by 2030, China's gross domestic product would grow to 36 trillion, over 40% larger than America's at 25 trillion. And since Beijing and Washington's defense budgets represent 2% and 3% of their respective economic outputs, China's military, already the world's second largest, should be comparable or perhaps even more powerful than America's around 2030, leaving Washington militarily dominant only in the Western Hemisphere. Indeed, the New York Times reported that as of 2019, quote, in 18 of the last 18 Pentagon war games involving China in the Taiwan Strait, the United States lost, end quote. As China pushes its maritime frontier further into the Pacific, engulfing and threatening Taiwan, Washington may well be faced with a difficult choice to either abandon an old ally or fight a war that it might well lose. Weighing Beijing's global future, it seems safe to assume that China can gain enough strength, at a minimum, to weaken Washington's global grip, and that it might serve, in concert with accelerating impact of global warming, as a catalyst to effect such a fundamental change in world power. Now, even if China were to become the preeminent world power sometime around 2030, the accelerating pace of climate change will likely curtail its global hegemony within 2 or 3 decades. Scientists at the nonprofit Climate Central reported in 2017 that rising seas and storm surges could, by 2060 or 2070, flood areas inhabited by about 275 million people worldwide, with 80% of those in Asia. According to this report, Shanghai is, quote, the most vulnerable major city in the world to serious flooding, where 17.5 million people are likely to be displaced, as most of the city could eventually be submerged in water, including much of the downtown area. Advancing the date of this disaster by at least a decade, a 2019 report in the scientific journal Nature Communications found that 150 million people worldwide are now living on land that will be below the high tide line by 2050. Using artificial intelligence to correct past errors in measurement of urban elevations, which the journal said were far too optimistic, the research determined that by 2050, rising waters, quote, will threaten to consume the heart of Shanghai, crippling one of China's main economic engines. Dredge from sea and swamp back in the 15th century, much of Shanghai will, in little more than 30 years, return to the waters from whence it came. While rising waters threaten Shanghai's survival, increasing temperatures will devastate the North China Plain, a prime agricultural and industrial region between Beijing and Shanghai, currently inhabited by about 400 million people, potentially making this the most lethal place on the planet. According to Professor Elithier, a specialist on hydrology and climate at MIT, quote, this spot is going to be the hottest spot for deadly heat waves in the future. Between 2070 and 2100, he estimates, the region could face periods of, quote, extreme danger when the combination of heat and humidity reaches something called wet bulb temperature of 31 degrees centigrade, and perhaps 5 lethal periods of 35 degrees wet bulb temperature when a combination of heat and high humidity prevents the evaporation of sweat that cools the human body. After just 6 hours under a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees centigrade, a healthy person, standing or sitting just as I am now, will be dead. 6 hours, just standing there, perfect health, you're dead in 35-degree wet bulb temperature. And China's going to have 5 periods of those by the end of the century. So if the Chinese century does indeed start around 2030, it's unlikely to last long, ending perhaps sometime around 2050, when its main financial center at Shanghai is flooded and its northern agricultural and industrial heartland is baking in insufferable heat. Given that Washington's world system and Beijing's emerging alternative are largely failing to limit carbon emissions, by mid-century the international community will likely need a new form of global governance to contain the damage. After 2050, the international community will quite possibly face a growing contradiction, even a head-on collision between the foundational principles of the current world order, that is to say, national sovereignty and human rights. As long as nations have the sovereign right to seal their borders, the world will have no way of protecting the human rights of the 200 million climate change refugees anticipated by 2050, or the 275 million by 2070. By 2050, if not earlier, the inability of individual nations, no matter how powerful, to cope with a crisis in the global commons should become blindingly apparent to all of us. If China were to turn inward to cope with its own climate crisis at mid-century, and the world were to face the spectacle of mass suffering by many millions of climate change refugees, the community of nations might well agree on the need for a new kind of collective response and an empowered form of global governance. Such a supranational body or bodies would need sovereign authority over 3 critical areas: emission controls, refugee resettlement, and environmental reconstruction. First, if the transition to renewable energy sources is still not complete by 2050, then this international body might well compel nations to curb emissions and adopt renewable energy. Next, under the auspices of the UN or a successor organization, a High Commissioner for Refugees would need the authority to supersede national sovereignty by requiring the nation-states of the world to help resettle such tidal flows of humanity. Finally, the future equivalents of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank and regional development banks could transfer resources from the wealthy, temperate countries to feed tropical communities decimated by climate change. These massive programs would change the very idea of what constitutes a world order, from the diffuse, almost amorphous ethos of the past 5 centuries into a concrete form of real global governance. Now, at present, no one can predict with any certainty whether such reforms will come soon enough to slow climate change or arrive too late to accomplish anything other than the management of endlessly escalating damage of uncontrollable environmental feedback loops. But one thing I think is becoming quite clear. The environmental change in the offing is so profound that anything less than the emergence of a new form of global governance, one capable of protecting the planet and the human rights of all of its inhabitants, introduces a strong prospect of armed conflict as wars over water, land, and people erupt in every part of the planet. Absent some fundamental change in our global governance, then humanity will, by mid-century, begin to face disaster of an almost unimaginable kind. Thank you.
By people just like you, that this is a story that deserves and in fact needs to be told 365 days a year. And I want to sing this song tonight especially for those of you who might, as I do, have loved ones overseas. And here's hoping that they come home safe and that they come home soon and that they never have to go again. The name is Francis Tolliver. I come from Liverpool. 2 years ago the war was waiting for me after school. To Belgium and to Flanders, to Germany to here, I fought for king and country I loved dear. It was Christmas in the trenches where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were still, no Christmas songs were sung. Our families back in England hosting us that day, the brave and glorious lads so far away. Well, I was lying with my messmates on the cold and rocky ground when across the lines of battle came a most peculiar sound. Says, I now listen up, my boys, each soldier strained to hear, as one young German voice sang out so clear. Singing bloody well, you know, my partner says to me. Soon one by one each German voice joined in harmony. The cannons rested silent, the gas clouds rolled no more, as Christmas brought us respite from the war. Well, as soon as they were finished and a reverent pause was spent, God rest ye merry gentlemen, struck up some lads from Kent. The next they sang was Stille Nacht, 'tis silent night, says I, and in 2 tongues one song filled up that sky. There's someone coming towards us, the frontline sentry cried. All sights were fixed on one lone figure, trudging from their side. His truce flag like a Christmas star shone on that plain so bright, as he bravely strode unarmed into the night. Soon one by one on either side walked into no man's land. With neither gun nor bayonet, we met there hand to hand. We shared some secret brandy, and we wished each other well, and in a flare-lit cell, we traded chocolates, cigarettes and photographs from home. These sons and fathers far away from families of their own. Young Sanders played his squeeze box. They had a violin, this curious and unlikely band of men. Soon daylight stole upon us, and France was France once more. With sad farewells we each began to settle back to war. But the question haunted every heart that beat that wondrous night: whose family have I fixed within my sights? 'Twas Christmas in the trenches, where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were warmed as songs of peace were sung. For the walls they'd kept between us to exact the work of war had been crumbled and were gone forevermore. Oh, my name is Francis Tolliver. In Liverpool I dwell. Each Christmas comes since World War I. I've learned its lessons well. That the ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame. And on each end of the rifle, we're the same.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much to John McCutcheon for contributing that song to our program today that really speaks to the nature, the human desire for peace on this planet. Coming up in the program, we're going to hear from some other members of Veterans for Peace, Fran Wiedenhoff and Larry Orr. But first, we're very pleased to have with us today three-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee, co-founder of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, winner of the 2017 Veterans for Peace Gandhian Nonviolence Award, Kathy Kelly.
I want to thank Madison Veterans for Peace for helping us celebrate Armistice Day by committing to put an end to war. A PBS film about World War I concluded with video footage of soldiers who had been at the front fighting trench warfare. And when they realized that there were no more explosions, that the war had ended, they didn't clap, they didn't cheer. They sank down exhausted and leaned against their packs. The United States recently negotiated a troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, not a peace agreement. And instead of allowing some time for people to recognize the horror of that war, the United States war planners have wasted no time planning for another war, this time a war with China. And we're in a permanent warfare state. And as these wars are planned, the sophistication of the weaponry grows increasingly. And so Professor Richard Falk warns us that in a war with China, it's likely both sides would be using artificial intelligence and drone warfare, and that ultimately the only way one side can get the best of the other side most likely would be through using nuclear weapons. And so we have a great deal to learn from those people who decided that it was time to prevent all future wars following World War I. And a book I've learned a great deal from is Vera Britton's memoir called A Testament of Youth. And she and her young Oxford student friends, which included her fiance and her brother, were so excited about World War I. The young men signed up, became enlisted officers, were going off to fight this glorious war. And she, not wanting to be left out, signed up to become a volunteer nurse at the front. The war transformed them. At one point, her hands covered with blood as she's trying to help the terrible suffering of a maimed soldier, she asks herself, will I ever laugh again? And the letters between her and her fiance Roland and her brother Edward and their friends all insisted that they would defy anyone to ever speak of a war as glorious. Vera survived. Roland and Edward and the two friends didn't. And so lonely and heartbroken, she nevertheless, after the war, teamed up with another nurse and went to Germany. And there she saw the torment of hunger and cold afflicting German people in the post-war time. And this, of course, greatly affected her perspective. And I believe that we, in the wars of choice our country wages, desperately need to understand the impact of these wars on people who can't escape. As the winter weather nears, I'm reminded of a story entrusted to me by a young Afghan friend who grew up in the Bamiyan province. His father had been killed by the Taliban. His young widowed mother worked hard to try to put food on the table and provide warmth in the winter, but there was never enough food, never enough warmth. They couldn't ever afford wood, and so they would huddle under heavy blankets. And one night in the bitter cold, one brother tried to snatch a blanket portion away from another brother, and that brother woke up, and the two of them, in their fright, battled each other over the blanket. And one was actually trying to suffocate the other. The battle turned into such rage. And finally, the horrified family members were able to pull the two young men apart, but it was a very difficult memory. Now, that young man that told me this story and one of his older brothers became part of a project that I witnessed year after year, and many people in Wisconsin helped it. And that involved paying widows a living wage to manufacture the heavy blankets and then distributing those blankets to refugee camps free of charge. Well, that's the kind of story that the surveillance drones that collected miles and miles and miles of footage flying every day all across Afghanistan could never absorb, could never analyze. And the drones will never be able to help us understand, as they say they will, patterns of life in another country. And this truth was brought home hideously in a recent attack, August 29th, when a United States drone got everything wrong and attacked a family, killing 10 family members, 7 of whom were children, 3 were toddlers. When the intel that the drone analysts were somehow trying to follow told the story completely wrong, and somehow they thought they were attacking an ISIS safe house, but it was the home of Zamari Ahmadi, who drove his car to do errands all day long. He wasn't picking up weapons, he was picking up canisters of water. And his family's bags were packed to go to the United States the next day. But the children in that family would be so excited because their father had a car. And when the car would come, they would all go outside and the dad would let 2 of the older brothers park the car. And that's what was actually happening. When the missile that the drone fired at the car was the kind of missile that has kind of like lawnmower blades that chop bodies into pieces. And so the Ahmadi family, August 29th, was murdered. Vera Britton didn't look away from World War I or from Germany. And that's our charge. Don't look away. We must see the faces of the Ahmadi family, commemorate their life, and know that while the US generals just the other day said that no wrongdoing happened, that you have to understand the context in which that attack happened. Well, we have to understand the larger context. Daniel Hale explained to us. He's serving 4 years in prison for disclosing the information that 90% of the time, over 1 5-month period, the drones routinely attacked the wrong person and civilians were killed. And so, as we promise one another not to look away as we join in solidarity, let's also remember to be grateful for all of the Armistice Day planning and belief that we can put an end to war. Thank you.
Hello again. I'm Larry Orr from the Madison, Wisconsin chapter, the Clarence Kalin chapter of Veterans for Peace. I'd like to share with you something that Kurt Vonnegut wrote. These are lines from his novel, Breakfast of Champions, published in 1973. I will come to a time in my backwards trip, he wrote, when November 11th was a sacred day called Armistice Day. When I was a boy, all the people of all the nations which had fought in the First World War were silent during the 11th minute of the 11th hour of Armistice Day, which was the 11th day of the 11th month. It was during that minute in 1918 that millions upon millions of human beings stopped butchering one another. I have talked to old men, he wrote, who were on the battlefields during that minute. They have told me in one way or another that the sudden silence was the voice of God. So we still have among us, at least in 1973, some who can remember when God spoke clearly to mankind. Armistice Day, he continues, has become Veterans Day. Armistice Day was sacred. Veterans Day is not. So I will throw Veterans Day over my shoulder. Armistice Day, I will keep. I don't want to throw away any sacred things. And then he goes on a little flippantly, as he always did. So what else is sacred? Oh, Romeo and Juliet, for instance, and all music. Kurt Vonnegut, 1973. I'd like to just add one thing, a syllogism, a comparison. Armistice Day is to peace what Veterans Day is to recruiting. Thank you. Peace.
You know, I was raised with an idea that I was just going to be a mom and a homemaker and a wife, and that was going to be enough for me. I knew I was going to have to fund my own education, and when I got done with my education, I wanted to be working and getting paid a decent salary. And I have always been very happy that I picked nursing, because I have enjoyed the profession of nursing every day. There's never been a day I went to work and felt like, oh geez, I wish I would have picked something else. I worked in nursing for about 10 years, and then I decided I wanted to go to anesthesia school. I didn't know how I was going to do it, so I thought about it, and I thought, oh, the Berlin Wall just came down, the United States and the rest of the world is heading for 1,000 years of peace, and we're going to enter a new era of, you know, everyone getting along. And so I joined the Army, thinking like I would never actually have to be involved in any conflict, and you know, that my commitments would be fulfilled by, you know, taking care of victims of natural disasters and things. And 9 months after I joined the Army, instead of going to anesthesia school, I was mobilized and deployed for Desert Storm. When I was in Desert Storm, taking care of, you know, for hours and hours, sometimes day and night, people that were being injured due to conflict, due to war, it was an overwhelming feeling of despair, because I realized how brutal people can really be to each other on a huge scale. And I came back and, just threw my whole self and my whole being into anesthesia school, and went and did well and excelled and was prepared to just, live happily ever after, finish my commitment to the military and get out of the military. The year that I actually was able to finish my commitment for my paybacks to the military, I was deployed to Afghanistan instead. We never had any patients come to our trauma hospital in Afghanistan that weren't just absolutely blown to bits. Children, adults, soldiers, civilians. Personally, I feel like I'm doing pretty well most of the time, with whatever experiences I had there. Last fall, I joined the Veterans for Peace because, I'm a soldier, but I'm also, a person who was raised as a socialist in this country. I've worked for political causes I believed in my entire life since I was old enough to walk. But the minute I became a soldier, a lot of these other groups that I used to work with felt uncomfortable with me. On a personal level, I feel like the soldiers have been completely abandoned, and I need to do whatever I can to get them out, because no one else is gonna protect them or think about them besides their families and their communities.
Friends, this is SciCon on Armistice Day 2021. On this day, we remember those who have borne the battle, and we send out our fervent hope that no daughter, no son, no mother, no father, no grandchild, no great-grandchild, no loved one will ever have to fight the battle again. May we have peace in our time, and soon. Season of peace, ground snowy white, we are at peace with each other tonight. But in how many places won't we sit at ease? Does the firing of guns break the silence of peace? Season of peace, season of war. When will these battles divide us no more? Work for the day when all wars will cease, and each day that we live is a season of peace. But in how many places do people still fight? Slave against master, black against white, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Jew, friend against neighbor, me against you. Season of peace, season of war. When will these battles divide us no more? Work for the day when all wars will cease, and each day that we live is a season of peace. Now on this earth, so shattered and torn, May our hopes be like the season reborn. May we work together with all that we're worth to bring a true season of peace on this earth. Season of peace, season of war. When will these battles divide us no more? Work for the day when all wars will cease, and each day that we live is a season of peace.
And that was musician Cy Khan with Season of Peace. And we hope that for all of you out there, this Armistice Day will mark a new season of peace in this world. I want to thank everybody that made this program possible tonight, all of the members of the Madison chapter of Veterans for Peace, the Clarence Kalin chapter. I want to thank our speakers, Larry Orr, Al McCoy, Kathy Kelly, Fran Wiedenhoff, our musicians, John McCutcheon and Cy Khan. I want to thank the Barrymore Theater for opening their doors to this event, as they do to so many events in our community, and especially to Steve Sperling and Brian Hatfield. I want to thank Brian Alberth and Left Effect Media and the Progressive Magazine for helping make this event possible tonight. Thank you.
My name is Francis Tolliver. I come from Liverpool. 2 years ago the war was waiting for me after school. From Belgium and to Flanders, to Germany to here, I fought for king and country I love dear. 'Twas Christmas in the trenches where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were still, no Christmas songs were sung. Our families back in England were toasting us that day, the brave and glorious lads so far away. Well, I was lying with my messmates on the cold and rocky ground, when across the lines of battle came a most peculiar sound. Says I, now listen up, me boys, each soldier strained to hear, as one young German voice sang out so clear. He's singing bloody well, you know, my partner says to me. Soon one by one each German voice joined in harmony. The cannons rested silent, the gas clouds rolled no more, as Christmas brought us respite from the war. Well, as soon as they were finished and the reverend pause was spent, God rest ye merry gentlemen, struck up some lads from Kent. The next they sang was Stille Nacht, 'tis silent night, says I, and in two tongues one song filled up that sky. There's someone coming towards us, the frontline sentry cried. All sights were fixed on one lone figure trudging from their side. His truce flag like a Christmas star shone on that plain so bright, as he bravely strode unarmed into the night. Soon one by one on either side walked into no man's land. With neither gun nor bayonet we met there hand to hand. We shared some secret brandy and we wished each other well, and in a flare-lit soccer game, we gave 'em hell. We traded chocolates, cigarettes, and photographs from home. These sons and fathers far away from families of their own. Young Sanders played his squeeze box. They had a violin, this curious and unlikely band of men. Soon daylight stole upon us, and France was France once more. With sad farewells we each began to settle back to war. But the question haunted every heart that beat that wondrous night: whose family have I fixed within my sights? 'Twas Christmas in the trenches where the frosts of bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were warmed as songs of peace were sung. For the walls they'd kept between us to exact the work of war had been crumbled and were gone forevermore. The name is Francis Tolliver. In Liverpool I dwell. Each Christmas comes since World War I. I've learned its lessons well. That the ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame, and on each end of the rifle we're the same.